I remember the morning more for its absence than its substance, as if the city had drawn a single, deliberate breath and chosen not to release it. Oxford has its rhythms, its small rituals, its unwavering dependence on sound. The bells define the hours, the way a pulse defines the living. Yet on that particular dawn, when I stepped out onto Broad Street with the stale taste of another sleepless night on my tongue, the tower of St. Ethelred's remained mute. I didn't register it at first. Silence can feel like a kindness when your head is noisy enough. Lewis had rung me earlier than decency should allow, and I left my flat with the half-distraction of a man who has pretended for years that he needs less rest than he actually does. The city was damp from a thin rain that had fallen sometime before dawn, leaving the cobbles slick and reflective, like old glass that still holds the memory of whatever has passed across it. A porter from the college stood near the railings, his shoulders hunched as he watched the tower with something close to trepidation. He nodded at me in that hesitant way people do when they aren't entirely sure if they want to be the one to break news. "The bell didn't ring," he murmured. "It should have. It always does." His words drifted through me like a half-remembered line of poetry. Something about the quiet felt unnatural, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps I'd grown too accustomed to Oxford's insistence that even grief must be announced on the hour. I told him I'd take a look, though my tone betrayed a mild irritation at the whole situation. I thought I was being summoned for a malfunction, not a mystery. Lewis was already inside the quadrangle, talking in that polite, earnest way he has when trying to coax useful truth from flustered academics. When he saw me, he gave the faintest lift of his eyebrows, the signal that something was wrong but had not yet revealed its full nature. The morning light was pale, suspended as though the sun had second thoughts about appearing. I followed him to the base of the tower. A body lay there, not splayed or twisted as one might expect from a fall, but folded inward, as if the man had knelt before collapsing, a final gesture of quiet refusal. The college chaplain hovered nearby, his hands clasped with a fervor that struck me as theatrical. He muttered a few words about tragedy, about accidents, about grief descending upon them like a thief in the night. All the while, he misquoted Donne with a confidence that bred distrust more quickly than guilt ever could. Lewis recited the facts with studious restraint. Male, early 60s, fellow of medieval history, believed to have ascended the tower sometime before dawn. No one saw him fall, no signs of forced entry. The bell never rang. He said it as though the last detail mattered as little as the chill in the air, yet even then it felt to me like the hinge upon which the morning turned. I looked up at the height of the Saiwa Tower. The geometry of the structure felt too precise for accidents. The stonework carried an old grief, the kind that settles into mortar and waits for repetition. A fall from there would not be graceful. It would fracture the body, scatter it. But the man before us looked almost untouched, as if whatever had taken him had required no violence. I crouched beside him and examined his hands. No gravel marks, no defensive scrapes, no sign of clutching at anything during a descent. Lewis waited for some pronouncement, but deduction never arrived on command. Instead, I found myself thinking of the bell above us, inert and watchful. A mechanism meant to speak had chosen to remain silent. Someone asked whether I thought it was an accident. I heard my own voice answer with a neutrality I did not feel. Perhaps. Oxford is full of them. But as we left the tower, I glanced once more at the mute bell and felt an unease press lightly at the back of my thoughts, the unmistakable sensation that the first sound of the day had been withheld, and not merely forgotten. I arrived at St. Ethelred's with the dull reluctance of someone returning to a place that remembers more than it forgives, and the college greeted me with the kind of hush usually reserved for libraries after dusk. Even the pigeons on the chapel roof seemed unsure whether they were permitted to move. Lewis walked beside me with that earnest tread of his, trying not to let the strangeness of the morning sit too visibly on his shoulders. He asked whether I thought the silence around the bell tower was merely atmospheric or something more intentional, and I heard myself answer in that evasive tone I sometimes adopt when the truth feels unfinished. Inside the quad, 3 figures waited for us with a patience that bordered on unease. Dr. Ivor Selwyn, looking as though sleep had negotiated only partial access to him, greeted us with a sigh that seemed older than his years. Clara Mendham, poised in a way that suggested discipline sustained by old wounds, stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the tower as if listening for the sound that had refused to come. Beside her, Edward Ashcombe, the bursar, seemed already impatient for the matter to resolve itself into something administrative, something quantifiable. They each offered their recollections of the previous night, and though their words differed in emphasis, they shared the faintly defensive cadence of people accustomed to the comforts of obscurity. Selwyn spoke of research that had carried him past midnight, yet his eyes betrayed the fluttering disquiet of someone rehearsing a timeline. Clara mentioned choir scores scattered across her sitting room, though I noticed a faint residue of tower dust on her sleeve that contradicted the distance she tried to place between herself and the scene. Ashcombe assured us he had been at home, but when I asked, almost casually, about the account ledgers due for audit, he answered before I finished the question, a haste that revealed either commendable readiness or unintended guilt. In the deceased fellow's study, I found the kind of order that feels imposed rather than natural. A diary lay open on the desk, a page conspicuously missing, its torn edge too neat to be the product of panic. Beside it rested a nearly completed crossword, the final clue untouched as though the answer hovered just out of reach. Something about its simplicity unsettled me. I brushed my finger over the indentation left by a pen that had lingered there, sensing the beginning of a thought the man had never committed to ink. When we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis asked whether any of it meant anything yet, and I told him it was far too early for meaning. But even then, the missing diary page, the dust on Clara's sleeve, and the bursar's haste formed a quiet constellation in my mind. Faint but insistent. The college wished to sleep through its scandal, yet scandals have a way of waking the wrong people first, and I felt the stirrings of a pattern that had not yet shown its full shape. I paused at the foot of the staircase, leading back into the quad, listening to the muted creak of steps above us, though no one appeared when we looked. Old buildings speak in their own riddles, but this sound carried the wary restraint of someone who had halted midway, uncertain whether to retreat or descend. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, yet it pressed on my thoughts with the same insistence as that unfinished crossword clue, as if both waited for the moment I stopped seeking and simply listened. The study still held the faint chill of that morning when Lewis handed me the photograph he had unearthed from the bottom drawer of the deceased's desk. He treated it with the delicacy one reserves for relics or wounds, unsure whether it belonged to personal history or evidence. I took it from him, feeling the brittle edge of the paper against my thumb, and for a moment the room seemed to withdraw into itself, as if the air understood the intimacy of what we were about to disturb. The photograph was undated, though the fashion suggested 2 decades earlier. The deceased stood at one side, looking younger, less burdened, his expression caught between pride and apology. Beside him stood a young woman with dark eyes that held a quiet command, a kind of self-possession rarely captured in photographs. And behind them, blurred almost to anonymity, lingered a shadow of a figure whose outline refused clarity, as though the camera had sensed their reluctance to be recorded. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, someone had written a line that resisted immediate interpretation, to silence what should have rung. I read it twice, feeling the words settle with uncomfortable precision. When we showed the photograph to Clara Mendham later that morning, she flinched with such restraint that only someone attuned to subtleties might have noticed. She examined it for barely a second before returning it to me with an expression too carefully composed. She said she had never seen the girl before, that the photograph must predate her time at the college. Yet something in her manner contradicted the neatness of the lie. Her eyes lingered not on the woman nor the deceased, but on the blurred figure behind them, as though searching for the ghost of a memory she did not wish to claim. Lewis, ever the diligent observer, asked whether the inscription meant anything to her. She shook her head with a gentleness that felt like dismissal rather than sincerity. I noticed dust along her sleeve, the kind particular to the corners of the tower stairs, a powder that clings more stubbornly than chalk. A coincidence, perhaps. Oxford is filled with dust that migrates from one place to another as though the entire city is shedding and remaking its skin. Back in the deceased's study, I held the photograph up to the window, letting the muted light reveal the faintest pressure marks where another photograph might once have been pressed against it, leaving behind a ghost frame. A pair, then. One missing. The absence felt curated rather than accidental. I traced the erased portion of the inscription, noticing where the ink had thinned, as though someone had tried to remove a name but lacked the courage to erase it completely. Lewis asked who the girl might have been, and whether she had any connection to the fellow's fall. I told him truth has a habit of moving sideways rather than forward, especially in Oxford, where memory and secrecy grow entangled like ivy against stone. The girl mattered, certainly. Her presence in the photograph carried the unmistakable weight of an unresolved story, but whether she was a victim, witness, or catalyst remained to be seen. As we left the study, a draft moved through the corridor, unsettling the loose sheet of the crossword on the desk. The unfinished clue glimmered for a moment, as if asking once again to be solved. It wasn't the clue itself that caught my attention, but the faint indentation beneath it, the suggestion of a word the deceased had tested and then abandoned. A small, overlooked hesitation. And I have learned, over too many years, that hesitation is often the most revealing form of truth. I slipped the photograph into an evidence envelope, though evidence felt too blunt a term for something so steeped in personal history. The girl's eyes followed me as I closed the door, steady, unblinking, as if urging me to listen more carefully to whatever silence she had left behind. I made my way back to the bell tower that afternoon, not out of obligation, but with the faint, persistent tug that arrives when a detail refuses to settle. The college had returned to its usual hush, the kind that seems cultivated rather than natural, as though every stone understood the value of silence. Rain had begun in thin, almost apologetic strands, tracing dark lines along the windowsills and the uneven paving beneath my feet. I remember thinking that Oxford always looked most honest beneath a grey sky, when its grandeur surrendered to something more vulnerable. At the foot of the tower, a barricade of tape fluttered weakly, its colors dulled by the damp. Lewis stood nearby, speaking with the porter who had first noticed the missing bell strike. The man repeated his account with the weary defensiveness of someone who fears his memory may betray him. I listened, though nothing he said altered the shape of the morning in my mind. When he mentioned hearing a faint clatter some time before dawn, I considered it carefully. A clatter can be anything: a stone dislodged, a door half caught by the wind, or the sound of a human miscalculation. But it had settled uneasily in him, and that unease was worth cataloguing. Inside the tower, the air felt older, almost untouched by the day's movements. A faint smell of dust and metal lingered, the scent of long-kept mechanisms and forgotten corners. I climbed the narrow steps, my hand brushing the cold rail as the structure creaked beneath my weight. Halfway up, I noticed fresh scratches near the locking plate, their edges too sharp to be dismissed as age. Someone had opened this door recently, and not with the ease of familiarity. Lewis caught up with me at the threshold, asking what I saw. I told him only that old towers rarely change their habits without reason. He looked unconvinced but nodded, as he often does when my answers lean towards the oblique. I pushed open the door, and we entered the chamber where the bell hung in quiet suspension. Its surface bore the dull sheen of metal that has outlived generations, yet something about its stillness felt less like rest, more like refusal. I stood beneath it, listening to the muted hum of rain outside, and tried to imagine the deceased standing here in the final hours of his life. There was a small alcove beside the mechanism, barely large enough for a person to stand, and I noticed the faint trace of shoe polish on the stone. It was recent enough to contradict the assumption that no one had been here before dawn. A tiny detail easily overlooked, yet it glimmered with significance. Lewis asked whether I believed the fellow might have come up here willingly. I answered that people rarely climb towers in the dark unless they seek something they cannot find elsewhere, clarity, perhaps, or solitude. Yet his hands, unmarred by stone, suggested he had not fought against any fall. The contradiction lingered, quiet but insistent. Before we descended, I glanced once more at the unfinished crossword clue folded in my pocket. Toll, the letters suggested, though the deceased had left the space blank. It seemed almost deliberate, as though he had hesitated at the threshold of meaning. I felt an echo of that hesitation then, sensing the outline of a truth not yet ready to step into the light. When we emerged from the tower, the rain had softened into mist, blurring the edges of the quad. I remember thinking that the bell, silent above us, knew more than it had chosen to tell. Its silence lingered long into dusk. The choir loft has always unsettled me in a way I can never quite articulate. Perhaps it is the height or the faint expectation of sound that lingers even when no one is present. That afternoon, as Lewis and I climbed the narrow wooden steps, I felt the peculiar quiet that only spaces designed for music can hold. The air smelled of old varnish and hymnals handled too often by uncertain hands. Dust shimmered above the pews as though the recent rehearsal had stirred more history than song. Clara Mendham stood near the rail, her posture disciplined, her gaze directed toward the far end of the chapel where rain traced slow lines across the stained glass. She acknowledged us with a calmness that felt almost studied, and I found myself struck again by her restraint. She asked whether we had learned anything new, and her tone carried the faint dryness of someone braced for unwelcome news. I told her we were still assembling fragments, though even that trace of honesty seemed to ripple through her. She turned back toward a stack of choral scores, arranging them with a deliberation that suggested she needed the familiarity of order. Lewis asked about her connection to the deceased, and she described him as a man of intelligence and impulse, though her voice softened at the mention of impulse. The softness interested me more than anything, she said. As she spoke, I noticed a small flake of stone caught near the cuff of her sleeve. It was barely visible, a pale remnant of some previous encounter with the tower stairs. I wondered whether she realized it was there, or whether she had grown accustomed to carrying dust from one place to another without recognizing its origin. She gestured toward the choir benches, explaining that she had been preparing for evensong when the news reached her. I listened not only to her words, but to the silence between them, a silence that hinted at something tightly held. The loft creaked beneath Lewis's shifting weight, a long, slow exhalation that felt almost like a warning. I asked whether the deceased had attended rehearsals lately, and she answered with a pause long enough to betray ambivalence. She said he had visited once the previous week, lingering near the organ loft, asking questions that seemed innocuous at the time. She did not repeat the questions, and I did not press her, though Lewis looked at me with that quiet expectancy that wonders why I allow evasions to breathe. Instead, I walked toward the organ bench, touching the worn surface where fingertips had shaped decades of music. A single sheet lay beneath the instrument, its margin marked with a notation that did not belong to Clara's precise hand. A motif repeated 3 times, each softer than the last. The pattern reminded me of a footfall, or perhaps a retreat. I folded the page and slipped it into my pocket. Clara watched, and for a moment her composure wavered, just slightly, in the space behind her eyes. I asked whether she recognized the motif, and she said it appeared in a lesser-known opera about betrayal and the consequences of truth. Her answer was careful, yet the care felt instinctive rather than rehearsed. I wondered whether she knew how close the music sat to the circumstances surrounding the deceased's final hours. As we prepared to leave, the light dimmed behind the stained glass, and the colors folded into one another like bruised water. Clara gathered her scores, and I noticed she hummed the motif from the stray sheet, barely audible, yet unmistakable. It drifted through the loft with the fragile persistence of something half-remembered. When she realized she was humming, she stopped abruptly, as though she had revealed more than she intended. I told her, music often says what we prefer not to, but she only smiled, the expression thin and brief. The loft door closed behind us with a muted click, and I felt the echo settle somewhere inside me, quiet but insistent. I found Selwyn in his room that evening, sitting beside a stack of papers he seemed neither willing nor able to touch. The fading light from the quad drifted through the mullioned window, settling on dust that had not yet chosen where to land. He greeted me with the tired politeness of a man who had long since accepted that truth, once invited, rarely leaves without taking something essential. I sensed at once that he had been expecting me, though he tried to disguise it beneath a shuffle of books and an awkward gesture toward a chair. He asked whether the investigation had produced any answers, and I replied that answers were far too ambitious a hope at this stage. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that begins in resignation and ends in memory. As I sat, I noticed a photograph on his desk, its frame turned downward, as though shielding something from view. When he saw my eyes fall upon it, he hesitated just long enough to betray the significance of whatever lay beneath. He kept his hand near the frame, not touching it, merely hovering, the way one might hover near the rim of a confession. He said the deceased had been a man prone to curiosities, often wandering into the past with more enthusiasm than caution. His tone shifted when he spoke of the woman in the old photograph. He described her not with the sentimentality of love, but with the quiet solemnity of someone recalling a truth that once carried promise. She had been brilliant, he said, but brilliance alone cannot always protect a person from the world they inhabit. He did not offer a name, and I did not ask. When memory lives that close to the surface, names become unnecessary and sometimes unbearable. Lewis listened from the corner, sensing the fragility of the moment. Selwyn leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple in the manner of a man trying to smooth the past into a shape he could tolerate. He admitted the deceased had visited him weeks earlier, asking questions about events long buried in the college's institutional memory. The inquiries, he said, felt less like research and more like excavation. He confessed that he had grown uneasy, not because he feared the truth itself, but because he suspected the college would not bear its return with grace. There was a tremor in his voice that he tried, unsuccessfully, to rein in. Regret, when it appears, tends to announce itself not in words but in posture. He kept his head slightly bowed, his shoulders drawn inward, as though bracing for a blow that might never come. He said he had discouraged the deceased from pursuing the matter, urging him to let certain stories remain undisturbed. Yet the deceased had thanked him with a softness Selwyn found unsettling. A softness, he said, that felt like farewell. I noticed then a small notebook on the table, its cover worn from years of reluctant handling. Selwyn placed a hand over it, a gesture that seemed almost instinctive. When I asked whether it was related to the woman in the photograph, he did not answer directly. Instead, he said some histories leave impressions that time cannot quite erase, and that the deceased had been attempting to match those impressions to facts. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment I understood that whatever he carried was not guilt, at least not in its simplest form, but a kind of sorrow shaped by inaction. As we prepared to leave, I asked whether he had seen the deceased on the night of his fall. The pause was long enough to fracture the quiet. He claimed he had been in his rooms, surrounded by books that offered more distraction than comfort. His voice wavered, not in deceit, but in longing for something irretrievably lost. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned noticing a light in the tower that night, a faint glow that disappeared too quickly to be dismissed as imagination. His words settled into me like a chord unresolved. Outside, the rain had resumed, tapping softly against the stone as though echoing the rhythm of a regret that had waited far too long to be spoken. I remember the bursar's office as a room that tried too hard to appear incorruptible. The walls were lined with framed certificates and tidy rows of ledgers, as though order itself could defend a man from suspicion. Edward Ashcombe greeted us with the stiffness of someone who believes politeness is a sufficient alibi, and he gestured toward the chairs as though we might contaminate the air by standing too long. The rain outside had soaked through my coat, and the faint drip from its hem punctuated the quiet with a rhythm far too honest for his liking. He asked whether we had made progress, and I offered him the kind of answer that reveals nothing except that the listener is being studied. His expression wavered, betraying the faintest thread of anxiety. It was not guilt, not quite, but the unease of a man, accustomed to shaping narratives to suit the expectations of committees rather than detectives. I allowed him to speak first. People often confess more by choosing their beginning than by completing any sentence. He talked about finances, budgets, the delicate balance between tradition and necessity. He spoke of the deceased with careful neutrality, as one might describe a colleague whose presence had become inconvenient, but whose absence now demanded respect. As he opened his ledger, a meticulous document thick with annotations, I caught the faint scent of old paper, ink, and something sharper beneath, the tang of secrecy pressed between the pages. He turned each sheet with exaggerated precision, as if performing a ritual he hoped would hypnotize us into missing what lay in plain sight. Lewis asked whether the deceased had been involved in recent audits, and Ashcombe answered too quickly, as though the question struck a nerve he had rehearsed dulling. He insisted the fellow's role had been peripheral. I watched the movement of his hands, expensive cufflinks, restless fingers tapping near a column of figures as he struggled to maintain composure. His tapping fell into a pattern that aligned with a repeated notation in the ledger margin. A date, a payment, a name partially obscured. I leaned forward and asked him about a series of irregular transactions, small enough to avoid scrutiny but frequent enough to suggest intention. His eyes tightened, and he replied that the college often disbursed discretionary funds for repairs, consultations, minor emergencies. But his voice thinned at the edges, and I recognized the brittle tone of someone reciting a justification crafted long before the question had been asked. I pointed out a discrepancy gap in the sequence of authorized signatures, a missing notation where one should have been. It was subtle, almost forgettable, yet it unsettled him more deeply than any direct accusation. He closed the ledger abruptly, a gesture meant to reassert control. The sound echoed too loudly in the small room, and the silence that followed felt weighted. He said he had been home on the night of the fall, tending to paperwork and correspondence. But when I mentioned that a car matching his same model, same registration prefix, had been seen near the college gate close to dawn, he faltered. Not panic, but calculation. A quick search for a plausible explanation. He offered one, of course, but its neatness lacked the organic mess of truth. As he shifted in his chair, the corner of a page slipped loose from the ledger, revealing a scribbled note in the deceased's handwriting. A single phrase, "Silence protects." I folded the corner back before Ashcombe noticed, but the words remained with me, lingering like the aftertaste of a drink poured too generously. They reminded me of the inscription on the photograph, of the unfinished crossword clue, of the tower that refused to speak. When we left the office, the corridor felt colder than before, as though the building itself had exhaled something it had been holding. Lewis asked whether I believed the bursar capable of murder, and I told him capability was rarely the question. Motive and fear, when intertwined, could move even the most respectable man, though not always in the direction one expects. Yet beneath the financial discrepancies, beneath Ashcombe's carefully measured words, I sensed a different kind of truth waiting to surface. Not guilt, exactly, but proximity, the kind a man acquires by standing too close to another's secret. I sometimes think the mind, when weary, tries to persuade itself of coherence long before coherence has earned the right to be believed. That afternoon, as Lewis and I walked through the quad beneath a sky the color of tarnished pewter, I felt the subtle pull of a conclusion forming too neatly, like a melody resolving itself without resistance. The bursar, with his evasions and ledger discrepancies, offered a shape that fit the outline of guilt almost perfectly. And yet I have learned, painfully and repeatedly, that the human instinct to settle on the comfortable culprit is stronger than any sense of justice. Lewis suggested that we draft a report outlining the likely sequence of events. A financial entanglement, an argument turned violent, a staged fall. His voice carried that cautious hope of a case drawing toward its end. I nodded, though the gesture felt borrowed from someone more decisive than I was at that moment. Closure has never come easily to me. I distrust it instinctively. Still, I allowed him his optimism, the way an older man allows a younger colleague the luxury of certainty. We returned to the deceased's rooms to gather the last of the paperwork. I lingered near the desk where the unfinished crossword lay curled at the edges. The final clue, still unanswered, seemed almost resentful of its incompleteness. I tapped the pencil against the page without writing anything. The grid had always unnerved me with a pattern meant to contain truth, but that often concealed it instead. I thought of Selwyn's regret, Clara's hesitation, Ashcombe's restless tapping. Each gesture fits into the bursar's guilt if forced hard enough. But something in the room resisted alignment. Lewis asked whether the bursar's presence near the gate that morning troubled me as much as it seemed to trouble him. I told him it did, though not in the way he assumed. His explanatory paperwork at the college, a misplaced file, was too plausible to be dismissed and yet too polished to be trusted. People rarely lie with such fluency unless they've practiced the lie long before it is required. We carried the deceased's papers into the hallway, where the floorboards creaked beneath our weight. The sound echoed down the corridor like a sigh from an unseen listener. I felt a tightening in my chest more than intuition. It held the shape of disquiet, a faint dissonance that unsettled the melody Lewis was so ready to resolve. False endings often sound the sweetest. As we stepped outside, the chapel bell, silent since the morning of the fall, gave a soft metallic groan as though testing its own capacity for sound. The noise was barely perceptible, yet it struck me with disproportionate force. Mechanical issues, the bursar had insisted earlier. But I had examined the mechanism myself. Whatever had silenced the bell had not been mechanical. It had been intentional. Lewis continued talking, offering theories in a meandering stream, his voice earnest and hopeful. I heard him only faintly. My gaze drifted toward the choir loft window, where the faintest flicker of movement broke the stillness. Clara, or a shadow unsettled by the shifting light. It vanished too quickly to be named. I thought of the motif she had hummed, the one she denied knowing. A musical line that belonged to a story of betrayal, not bookkeeping. We reached the cloister, and I paused beneath the archway, feeling the cold stone at my back. The rain had begun again, slipping down in thin, insistent threads. In their rhythm, I heard the unfinished crossword, the erased diary page, the inscription on the photograph. None aligned with the bursar's ledger. They pointed elsewhere toward a quieter, more private desperation. Lewis asked whether something was wrong. I told him the case was beginning to resolve itself, though even as I said it, I felt the falsity of the words. Resolution requires harmony. What we had instead was a melody circling itself, refusing completion. A false ending, I thought, a minor key pretending at closure, and somewhere behind it, hidden in the quieter measures, a truth waiting for its cue to emerge. It was late when I returned to the deceased's study, the quad outside sunk in that particular kind of darkness that feels less like night and more like the absence of intention. I carried no expectation with me, only the faint irritation of a man who senses he has been listening to the wrong frequency. The room greeted me with the same stillness it had held from the beginning. Papers arranged with academic precision, shelves leaning slightly with the weight of scholarship, and the smell of old bindings rising from the carpet as though memory itself had settled there. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, believing we had reached a plateau. I envied him for his certainty, even as I distrusted it. I stood at the desk and opened the diary again, the one with the torn page. Earlier, the absence had felt incidental, but now it loomed with new insistence. I angled the book beneath the desk lamp and traced the ragged edge with my thumb. There were faint impressions in the paper beneath, the kind left when someone presses too hard while writing. Ghost words, the indentations of urgency. I fetched a pencil from the drawer and shaded the page lightly, watching shapes emerge like whispers rising through dust. A few lines appeared hesitant, broken, yet unmistakably the deceased's hand. She deserved to be heard, a place in the tower, something hidden, and beneath those fragments, a name smudged beyond legibility, but even smudges have voices. The first letter curved inward, the second ascended too sharply. A woman's name, a woman in the photograph. I felt the atmosphere shift, though the air itself remained inert. A new silence had filled the room. A silence not of absence, but of revelation withheld. I realized then that the first silence belonged to the bell, the second belonged to the dead. I sat in the chair and let the pieces drift into alignment. The deceased had not been researching the financial discrepancies. Not truly. His questions had burrowed deeper toward the shadowed history of the girl in the photograph, toward a story the college had allowed to fade into comfortable myth. I recalled Selwyn's trembling admission, his voice fraying when he spoke of the past, and Clara humming, her hesitation, her eyes lingering on a figure blurred into anonymity. The three of them are bound by something quiet and unresolved. Outside, a soft rustle passed through the corridor, like the hush of someone stopping midway down the hall. I listened, but the sound dissolved before meaning could attach to it. Old buildings have many ways of keeping company with the living. I returned to the crossword, still folded where I had left it. The unanswered clue felt heavier than a puzzle should allow. Toll. It was the obvious solution, yet the deceased had left the space blank. Perhaps he had known that obvious answers rarely touched the truth. Or perhaps he had hesitated for the same reason that made Clara falter, that made Selwyn hover over the edge of confession. Some truths demand silence because speaking them fractures too much. I placed the crossword beside the shaded diary page and noticed, for the first time, a faint alignment. The indentation beneath the final clue formed a small arc stroke of a pen that had begun a letter before pausing. It matched the curve of the smudged name in the diary. A connection, delicate and persistent. A line drawn between the dead and the disappeared. I closed the diary carefully. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. I understood now that the first silence had been engineered, the bell muted to prevent its morning cry. But the second silence, the one breathing through the study, had been cultivated by the living. A silence born not of malice, but of fear and grief tangled so tightly they could no longer be distinguished. As I stepped out into the corridor, The boards creaked with that familiar, mournful reluctance. The chapel window glimmered faintly across the quad, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure watching from the loft still, composed as if she had been waiting for the silence to be broken at last. I returned to the tower just before dusk, drawn not by evidence but by a faint, persistent intuition that the building itself had been listening and had chosen, until now, to remain discreet. The sky had settled into that uncertain blue-gray that makes Oxford stone appear older than history allows, and the air smelled of rain that had not yet decided whether to fall. I climbed the steps slowly, feeling each creak beneath my weight like a muted acknowledgement. The tower had heard things that I was certain, but it had not yet decided how much it wished to share. When I reached the landing, the silence pressed closer, not oppressive, but observant. I stood for a long moment, imagining the deceased here in the final minutes of his life. I pictured his hand on the rail, his breath shortening with realization rather than fear. The tower did not offer me the luxury of clarity. It gave only atmosphere, faint impressions, the lingering residue of a moment too intimate for the living to reconstruct fully. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, his footsteps echoing with a softness that betrayed his reluctance to intrude. He asked what I expected to find, and I told him the truth I did not know, but the truth lies in pauses, not statements, and the deceased had left many pauses behind. Lewis leaned against the wall, watching me with that patient curiosity he has cultivated over years of enduring my methods. I walked to the bell once more, resting my hand on the cold metal. The mechanism remained intact, unrepaired, unaltered. Its silence had been deliberate. I recalled the bursar's insistence that the bell often faltered and Clara's strangely steady gaze when I questioned her in the loft. Something connected them both, but not through conspiracy, through fear. Fear has a way of binding the unconnected, drawing lines where none should exist. I looked down at the alcove beside the mechanism, where the faint traces of shoe polish still lingered. They had darkened slightly since I first saw them, absorbing moisture from the air. I crouched and examined the stone again, noticing a second mark I had missed before a faint scuff on the opposite wall, as though someone had steadied themselves not during a struggle, but during a moment of collapse, emotional rather than physical. Such marks do not reveal guilt, only humanity. Lewis reminded me gently of the bursar's inconsistencies, his hurried explanations, his nearness to the college that morning. I acknowledged them, but they no longer held the weight they once did. His lies were the lies of a man desperate to protect his reputation, not his conscience. Selwyn's sorrow, too, had shifted in my mind, not toward guilt, but toward grief buried under decades of quiet punishment. The tower had held too many secrets for too long, and the deceased had merely brushed against the wrong one. I moved toward the narrow window that overlooked the quad. The stained glass caught the fading light, and for a moment I saw the reflection of the choir loft across the square. Clara's silhouette lingered in my memory, the careful posture, the tremor she tried to hide. The motif she hummed, unbidden. A musical confession made without words. I told Lewis I needed to speak with her again. He asked whether I believed she had seen the deceased that night. I said she had seen more than she wished to. Silence, I reminded him, is rarely empty. It is shaped, curated, defended, and in this case, it had been inherited. Before we left, I listened once more to the tower's stillness, letting it settle around me like a final breath. In that quiet, I sensed not the moment of death, but the moment before it, the brief, fragile hesitation when truth rises into the light and someone decides it must be pushed back into shadow. The tower had heard the struggle of conscience, not violence. And conscience, I knew, leaves deeper echoes than any fall.